They had burned their way across half the known world. The grandsons of Genghis Khan had shattered Baghdad, the intellectual capital of Islam. They had swallowed China, torn through Persia, and left a trail of ash from Korea to the gates of Europe. When the Mongols came, kings did not fight. They calculated how much of their treasury they could ship out before the walls fell, and now they were riding for Delhi. Tens of thousands of horsemen, the most feared cavalry in human history, pouring down through the mountain passes of the northwest into the heart of India. Behind the walls of Delhi waited a sultan who had seized his throne by murdering the uncle who raised him. A man most of his own court did not trust. A man ruling a city stuffed with refugees, rival nobles and hungry mouths. By every measure that mattered, Delhi should have fallen. The Mongols had beaten larger armies. They had cracked stronger walls. They had a way of turning a city's own panic into a weapon. And Delhi, in these years, had plenty of panic to spare. But here's the strange part. They didn't take it. Not once. The Mongols came back to Delhi again and again across a single brutal decade, and every time something turned them away. Sometimes it was a battle, but at least one of those times, the thing that broke the greatest war machine on earth wasn't a bigger army or a taller wall. It was a decision about the price of grain. That's not a metaphor. Somewhere in the middle of all this bloodshed, the man on Delhi's throne did something no general in the Mongol wars had thought to try. He didn't just plan to fight the invaders on the battlefield. He built a system, a cold, deliberate, citywide machine, designed to make sure that when the Mongols came, his army would be fed, mobilized, and paid, while their whole strategy quietly fell apart from the inside. Nobody remembers his name today the way they remember Genghis Khan. But for a few years at the turn of the 14th century, this man did something the Khans of Persia, China, and the Middle East could not do. He made the Mongols lose. The question is how, and the answer is stranger and quieter than any battle. Stay with me, because to understand it, you first have to understand just how close Delhi came to becoming another Baghdad. To make sense of what happened, you have to go back to the man on the throne. His name was Alauddin Khalji, and he was not supposed to be sultan. He came to power in 1296, the way a lot of medieval rulers did, through blood. His uncle Jalaluddin was the reigning sultan, and he had trusted Alauddin completely. He had raised him, promoted him, married him into the family. So when Alauddin returned from a wildly successful raid deep into the wealthy south of India, loaded with more gold and plunder than anyone in Delhi had ever seen, his uncle came out to greet him warmly. Alauddin had him killed, right there, and with the mountain of southern treasure at his back, he bought the loyalty of the army and the nobles before anyone could organize against him. So picture the position he's in. He rules the richest city in the region, but he rules it as a usurper. Half the court remembers exactly how he got the throne. His own family has reason to hate him, and a sultan who can't trust the people around him is a sultan who can be overthrown the moment he looks weak. Now at the Mongols. Because here's the thing most people don't realize about medieval India. The Mongol threat wasn't a single dramatic invasion. It was a grinding, relentless pressure that lasted for years. Wave after wave of horsemen from the Chagatai Khanate, the Mongol domain centered in Central Asia, came pouring down through what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan into northern India. They weren't just raiding for loot anymore. At least once they came intending to stay, to do to Delhi what their ancestors had done to Baghdad. And a sultan who had just murdered his way to power now had to defend the whole civilization against the most successful conquerors in world history. If you think you already know how this ends, the plucky defender, the last-minute cavalry charge, the triumphant king, I promise you don't. Because the most important thing Alauddin ever did in this war, he did nowhere near a battlefield. If you're the kind of person who likes history that surprises you, this is exactly where it gets strange. And it's worth sticking around for the reveal. So consider subscribing, because what comes next is not what you'd expect. Let's talk about what Alauddin was actually afraid of. It wasn't losing a single battle. He could lose a battle and recover. What terrified him was the thing that had killed empires all across Asia, a Mongol invasion that arrived faster than he could respond to it. Because Mongol armies didn't move like other armies. They moved light, they moved fast, and they lived off the land, meaning they could appear at your gates before your own forces were even assembled. By the time a normal medieval kingdom finished raising taxes, hiring soldiers, buying horses, and gathering supplies, the enemy was already inside the walls. Speed was the Mongol superpower, not just in battle, in the whole rhythm of war. And Alauddin understood something that most of his enemies never figured out. You couldn't beat that kind of enemy by simply being braver. You had to beat their speed. You had to build a kingdom that could put a fed, funded, fully equipped army in the field faster than the Mongols could reach you. But how do you do that? How do you make an entire economy move at the speed of war? That was the puzzle, and the way Alauddin solved it would have consequences no one, not his enemies, not his own people, saw coming. Because the first Mongol test was already on its way, and it would come close, terrifyingly close, to ending everything. Imagine you are standing on the walls of Delhi in the year 1299. To the north, the horizon is wrong. It's moving. A haze of dust rising off the plain, and beneath it, the shapes of tens of thousands of riders. A Mongol army under a commander the sources call Kutlug Khwaja had come, and this time they hadn't come to raid the countryside and leave. They had come for the city itself. They did something the earlier raiders hadn't. They cut the roads. They blocked the supply routes into Delhi. The idea was simple and merciless. Don't waste men storming the walls. Just wrap your hands around the city's throat and squeeze until it can't breathe. And it worked, at first. Inside Delhi, prices exploded. Food grew scarce. The city was swollen with people who had fled the countryside, and now all those mouths were trapped behind the walls with a shrinking amount of grain. This is the moment. This is exactly how Baghdad-style catastrophes begin. Not with the breaking of a wall, but with the slow starvation and panic of the people behind it. So what does Alauddin do? Here's where you'd expect the clever trick. The secret granaries, the market genius that saves the day. But that's not what happened in 1299. And this is the part the dramatic version of the story gets wrong. In 1299, Alauddin did the old-fashioned thing. He gathered his advisors, and most of them told him to wait behind the walls, to let the siege play out and hope the Mongols got tired. It was the safe choice. It was also, he realized, the losing choice, because waiting was exactly what the Mongols wanted. So he did the opposite. He marched out to meet them. His army rode north to a place called Kili, just outside the city, and there the defenders of Delhi did something the Mongols were not used to. They stood and fought a pitched battle against the cavalry that had terrorized a continent. And in the middle of that battle, one of Alauddin's commanders, a general named Zafar Khan, did something reckless and magnificent. Hold on to him, because his story is about to take a turn that tells you everything about how dangerous this enemy really was. The Mongols had a signature move, one that had destroyed army after army. They would pretend to break. They would turn their horses and flee in apparent panic, and the enemy, smelling victory, would chase them. And once the pursuers were strung out and exhausted and far from their own lines, the Mongols would wheel around and annihilate them. Zafar Khan chased them. He drove deep into the Mongol formation, further and further, cutting them down. And then the trap closed. The fleeing Mongols turned. He was surrounded, cut off from the rest of the army, deep in enemy ranks with no way back. And here is the what? The detail the sources preserve that turns a battle into a legend. Zafar Khan fought so ferociously and killed so many that even the Mongols were shaken by him. The story goes that for years afterward, when a Mongol horse refused to drink or startled at a shadow, the riders would ask it if it had seen the ghost of Zafar Khan. He died out there, surrounded. But the Mongols had been hurt badly enough that they pulled back from Delhi. Delhi survived 1299. Barely. By the sword, not by any trick. But Alauddin came away from that siege with a lesson burned into him. He had won, and it had almost not been enough. He had been forced to gamble everything on a single open battle because he had no other option. His army had been slow to gather. The city had nearly starved. If the Mongols had been just a little more patient, just a little luckier, Kili is where this story would have ended. He was not going to leave it to luck again. And so, in the years after Kili, Alauddin began building the strangest weapon in the whole Mongol war. Not a wall, not a sword, a market. But the Mongols weren't finished. Not even close. Because a few years later, they came back, and this time, they didn't stop at cutting the roads. The year is a 1332, and Alauddin has the worst possible timing. His main army isn't in Delhi. He had sent his best troops far to the south and east on campaigns, to Chittor, to the Deccan, chasing the wealth that kept his whole regime afloat. His forces are scattered across the subcontinent, hundreds of miles from the capital, and that is the exact moment a Mongol commander named Taghi chooses to strike at Delhi with tens of thousands of horsemen. This is the nightmare scenario. This is the thing Alauddin had lain awake fearing, the enemy arriving faster than he could pull his army back together. He raced to Delhi with what few troops he could scrape up, and he was so short of men that he couldn't even fight. He was forced to shut himself and his soldiers inside a fortified camp near the city and simply endure the Mongols' late siege. And this time there was no Zafar Khan, no glorious charge. Just the Sultan of Delhi trapped, waiting, watching the enemy sit outside his walls. By the accounts that survive, this was the most dangerous the Mongols ever got. The roads were cut. Reinforcements couldn't get through. Alauddin was pinned in place, and everyone knew it. So how did Delhi survive when its own army wasn't even there? Here's the thing. The Mongols, for all their terror, had a weakness, and it was the mirror image of their strength. They lived off speed and plunder. They moved fast and fed off the land precisely because they did not carry heavy supply trains or settle in for long grinding sieges. That was never their game. A Mongol army that had to sit still, week after week, in hostile country, running low on fodder for its horses and food for its men, was a Mongol army slowly coming apart. Delhi didn't have to beat them. Delhi had to outlast them. And Taghi, unable to crack the fortified camp, unable to sustain his horsemen indefinitely in enemy territory, eventually did what Mongol armies always did in the end. He withdrew. Delhi had survived a second time, and this time it had survived by not breaking, by having just enough, held together just long enough to make the invasion collapse under its own logistics. Now Alauddin understood the whole shape of the problem. He'd nearly lost in 1299 because his army gathered too slowly. He'd nearly lost in 113 because he couldn't feed and field the force fast enough when he was caught off guard. Both times the real battlefield hadn't been the wall. It had been the question of who could keep an army supplied. And this is where the economic weapon finally comes together. This is the reveal. Because after 1303, Alauddin did something that historians still study today. He didn't just reform his army. He reached his hand into the entire economy of Delhi and seized control of the price of everything. He fixed the price of grain, of cloth, of horses, of slaves, of cooking oil, of vegetables, of sugar. He set the exact price at which every essential thing could be sold in the markets of Delhi, and he built an entire apparatus of officials, inspectors, and spies to enforce it. Merchants who cheated the fixed price were brutally punished. He established state granaries, stockpiled grain, and controlled its release so that even in a bad harvest, the price would not move. And here is the wait what that most people miss. We tend to imagine price controls as an economic policy, a tax thing, a bureaucratic thing. But that is not primarily why Alauddin did it. He did it to defeat the Mongols. Think about what a huge standing army actually costs. Soldiers have to be paid. If the price of food and goods keeps rising, you have to keep raising their pay just to keep them fed. And eventually, you can't afford the army at all. But if you freeze the cost of living, you can pay a soldier a fixed, modest wage. And that wage will feed him and his family year after year. By controlling prices, Alauddin could afford something almost no medieval state could. A massive, permanent standing army, garrisoned and ready. Paid for on the cheap because the cost of everything was locked in place. An army that didn't have to be slowly, expensively assembled every time the Mongols appeared. An army that was already there. Do you see what he did? The thing that had nearly killed him twice. The slowness, the scramble to gather and feed a force, he made it disappear. He turned the marketplace of Delhi into the supply engine of a war machine. the very speed advantage that made the Mongols unbeatable. He neutralized not by moving faster in battle, but by never having to catch up in the first place. The Mongols' whole strategy assumed the enemy would be slow. Alauddin made Delhi fast, through the price of grain. They came in at 13-5, and then again. But the Mongols who rode down into India after Alauddin's reforms were riding into a completely different country than the one that had nearly starved in 1299. Now, when the dust rose on the northern horizon, Delhi didn't panic. It didn't scramble. Alauddin had commanders and standing troops ready to move. A professional force, fed and paid by the machine he'd built. At a place called Amroha in 13-5, a Mongol army under commanders the names Ali Beg and Tartak met Alauddin's forces under a general named Malik Kafur, and this time it was the Mongols who were caught, cornered and crushed. Every other kingdom the Mongols had faced fought them as a series of emergencies. Raise the tax, hire the men, gather the food, pray you're fast enough. And one emergency at the wrong moment, one invasion that came a little too fast, was all it took to end you. That's how Baghdad fell. That's how Persia fell. Delhi didn't fight the Mongols as an emergency. Delhi fought them as a routine, a system, a machine that could absorb wave after wave because the whole economy had been rebuilt to feed the war. And the Mongols, for all their genius, had no answer for it. So they kept coming, and they kept losing. The captured Mongol soldiers were brought back to Delhi in chains. Thousands of Mongol prisoners were executed. The men who had made the world tremble were dying in the dust outside the one city they could not take, because their enemy had beaten them with a weapon they never learned to see. But here is the cruel final twist, the part almost nobody tells you. The weapon that saved Delhi did not outlast the man who built it. Alauddin's price control system was not some gentle economic reform. It was one of the most ruthless surveillance states of the medieval world. An empire of informers. Merchants terrified into honesty. A capital where the sultan knew the price of every sack of grain and punished the smallest cheat with savage force. It worked. But it worked because one iron-willed, deeply paranoid man was standing over it every single day, holding it in place by sheer force of will. And that same paranoia devoured him at the end. In his final years, Alauddin grew sick and suspicious, and real power slipped into the hands of Malik Kafur, the very general who had crushed the Mongols at Amroha. The court that Alauddin had ruled through fear began to turn on itself. When he died in 1316, the machine he had built to defeat the greatest army on earth did not survive the men who inherited it. The price controls collapsed. The system came apart. And within a few short years, the dynasty itself was gone. The Mongols never took Delhi. But the weapon that stopped them couldn't stop the thing that finally brought the whole edifice down. The ambition and betrayal inside its own walls. He beat the conquerors of the world. He could not beat his own court. So what does this leave us with? In the immediate term, the result was extraordinary. At the very moment the Mongols were still a living, breathing threat to the entire Islamic world, one sultanate in northern India didn't just survive them. It turned them back repeatedly and broke the myth that the Mongols could not be beaten in a sustained war. In the longer term, that survival mattered far beyond Delhi. Because the Chagatai Mongols were checked in India, the northern plains were never subjected to the kind of total devastation that Baghdad and so much of Persia suffered. The cultural and political world of the subcontinent kept developing along its own path, instead of being erased. A great deal of what came after, the whole later history of the region, rests partly on the fact that these invasions failed. And now the counterfactual. Imagine one throw goes differently. Imagine Taghi catching Alauddin with his army scattered 1,000 miles away. Presses just a little harder, or the fortified camp breaks, or the sultan is captured. Delhi falls the way Baghdad fell. The greatest, wealthiest city in the region becomes another Mongol conquest, and the whole subsequent history of India tips onto a different track. It was that close. It came down to whether a trapped man could hold out just long enough for his enemy's supply lines to fail. Which brings us back to the question we started with. How did one city do what the caliphs of Baghdad and the shahs of Persia could not? How did it break the war machine that broke the world? Not with a bigger army, Not with a taller wall, not even, in the end, with the ghost of a single heroic general. It did it with the price of grain, the most feared cavalry in human history. The men who had turned speed and hunger into weapons that toppled empires were finally stopped by a ruler who understood that wars are won long before the fighting starts, in the boring, invisible business of who can feed an army and who cannot. Alauddin Khalji didn't outfight the Mongols. He outsupplied them. And that may be the quietest, strangest truth of the whole Mongol age. The empire that conquered the world was beaten. At least once, not by a hero, but by a market. If you want more history where the real story is hiding underneath the one everyone thinks they know, subscribe, because there is so much more of this to tell. Next time, the Mongols shattered army after army with a single trick, the fake retreat that lured entire nations to their deaths. How did it work? Why did it fool brilliant commanders again and again? And what finally happened when one army figured out the secret? You won't believe who cracked it.